Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider and a board member of the Washington Outsider Center for Information Warfare. With us today to discuss the 80th anniversary of the Raoul Wallenberg case and the work of the Raoul Wallenberg Center is Susanne Berger, who is a graduate of American University in Washington, D.C. Her research at the center addresses the wider political and economic aspects of Wallenberg's humanitarian mission to Budapest, as well as their associated effects on the investigation of his disappearance. For 6 years, she served as a consultant to the Swedish-Russian Working Group on the fate of Raoul Wallenberg. In January 2001, she presented a report on her findings entitled Swedish Aspects of the Raoul Wallenberg Case. Her articles on this issue and related concerns have appeared in various international publications. And she has reviewed the 2003 Eliasson Commission report on the Swedish foreign establishment's handling of the Raoul Wallenberg case, offering a comprehensive analysis of current research. Most recently, she addressed the concerns about Sweden's foreign ministry handling of the case and the apparent cover-up. Susanne, thank you so much for joining us today. So before we get into all of this, I just wanted to you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the Wallenberg issue to begin with. What drew your interest?
Well, I'm born in Hanover, Germany, and I grew up in Germany and first studied in Mainz. And then I studied actually anthropology and history. And then I came to the United States on a scholarship to American University, where I got interested in international relations and economics. And after graduation, I started working as a freelance journalist for a while, and I worked for German television. And then I started to write articles for various news agencies. And in 1993, the CIA released the records in the Wallenberg case, and I wrote an article about this. And this is how I got to meet Wallenberg's brother, who at the time was on a visit to the United States. And this is how I got involved in the work, in the research work, because I realized that there had not really been a very profound systematic investigation in the case. But at the time, the work of the Swedish-Russian Working Group had started as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I discussed some of the findings in the American archives with Wallenberg's brother and also other researchers. And then I was invited to participate in the work of the group.
So let's start with the very basics for those who are not familiar with the story. Who was Raoul Wallenberg and why was he important?
Raoul Wallenberg was a young Swedish businessman who in 1944 accepted a diplomatic commission to go to Hungary to protect the remaining Jewish community of Budapest. At the time, there were only about 120,000 Jews in Budapest that were left after the German occupation of Hungary. This was sort of the last chapter, but one of the most traumatic chapters in the Holocaust. About 500,000 Jews were deported to their deaths to Auschwitz within a short period, about 6 months. And at the time, there were appeals for help to the Americans, and the Americans in turn turned to the only entities that could really offer any assistance, which were the neutral legations in Hungary from neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden. And Sweden was really the only country that heeded the call. And since Raoul Wallenberg had important business contacts to Hungary, had traveled to the country, had very good connections in Sweden, was very well versed in negotiations as a businessman. So he was in many ways considered to be the ideal candidate, because the Jewish community and also the Americans at the time were looking for someone who could be attached to the embassy, but who could provide some kind of or implement some kind of protective system. It put some kind of measures in place that would uh, allow Jewish citizens to be protected in Hungary, but also then be able to potentially travel to Sweden. And this concerned first and foremost Jews who had associations with Sweden, including business associations. So this is how this whole project started. And then Wallenberg, once he traveled to Hungary, he really expanded this very limited program and turned it into really a vast rescue effort together with his colleagues and aid from the Hungarian resistance into really, a system that protected, housed, fed, and saved thousands of people.
So, what happened to him? Why is there a case? It seems straightforward enough. A heroic individual works on a diplomatic program. Should be a happy ending, a happy story, all around accolades. Why isn't it?
What happened is that at the end of hostilities, when the Soviets occupied Hungary and the German and Hungarian Nazi armies were defeated, Raoul Wallenberg tried to reach out to the headquarters of the Soviet forces to seek protection for the Jewish community that, for the Jewish houses. They had established Swedish houses that flew the Swedish flag. There was these individuals held special Swedish protective documents called the so-called Schutzpass, which is a very famous document. And so he asked for protection, but at the time, the Soviet forces were very, very suspicious of all foreigners. They considered all of these individuals who had engaged themselves in the protection of Jews or had engaged themselves in the activities of a foreign country as hostile or potentially engaged in anti-Soviet activities. So at some point, the decision was made, and we still do not know the exact reasons why, by the Soviet leadership and most likely Stalin personally, to detain Raoul Wallenberg and to transport him to the Soviet Union. And he was arrested, he was detained, he was he was not allowed to communicate with his colleagues or with any outsiders, and he was brought to Moscow. At the time, nobody knew what had happened. He just simply disappeared.
Why would the Soviets have problems with him? Why would they want to take him?
It's very difficult to say. I think it's easier to answer the question why they decided to take him than why Stalin decided not to release him. Those are two separate issues. And the first is really, as I said, there were the Soviets were very paranoid about any kind of diplomats or foreigners that they encountered, so that they also detained other foreign diplomats. And Wallenberg had associations with the Americans. His mission had been funded through American money. So all of these factors contributed to his being detained. And so this part one can still potentially understand. And his colleagues were also temporarily detained, but they were allowed to travel to Moscow and then return home to Sweden. But he was not. And this remains one of the crucial unanswered questions. Why did Stalin decide not to release him? Why could his case not be resolved?
Was there any evidence or suspicion, or at least claim by the Soviets, that Wallenberg was involved in any sort of subversive anti-Soviet activity, whether independently or with the American assistance?
It's very difficult to know exactly what the Soviet officials or Soviet entities, the Soviet State Security Service really knew or what they suspected. They, of course, arrested an enormous amount of people, some of whom reported about Wallenberg's activities and those of the Swedish legation. There were, for example, some charges that the legation had intentionally or by accident provided protective documents to Hungarian and German Nazis, that they had failed to protect Soviet prisoners of war, that they had allowed mistreatment of Soviet prisoners of war. And then, of course, that Wallenberg, he came from a very powerful Swedish banking family
Hmm.
that had very intensive and close business ties with Nazi Germany. So there were some questions whether or not these business deals, these wartime business deals, were in some ways potentially a motive for his arrest. There could have been fears that Raoul Wallenberg could be used in a show trial, for example, which would have, of course, been an enormous scandal. And then, of course, there are some questions about whether or not he had any formal ties to foreign intelligence services. The working group, our investigation as such, could not establish any ostensible ties, evident ties, but it's clear that he was, of course, compromised in certain ways through his ties to the Americans, because his mission, the person who had actually hired him in Stockholm was a member of the Office of Strategic Services. His name was Ivor Olson. He was also associated with the War Refugee Board. But so even though Wallenberg didn't have a formal mission from the Americans, at least not overtly, there are questions whether his activities were really limited entirely to humanitarian activities, or if there were other aspects to his mission. And this now, in recent years and months, some questions have also surfaced regarding Swedish intelligence operations in Hungary, which were really much more extensive than previously known, and which were also in part directed against the Soviet Union, because they involved reporting on the Soviet Union. And this was a problem because Sweden at the time represented Soviet interests in Hungary and was, of course, also neutral. So, the Swedish side may have been concerned that, the exposure of these kind of ties could be potentially problematic, could arise anger on the part of the Soviets. But we really do not know how much the Soviets actually knew about this and how they evaluated this. Or if Stalin, for example, simply wanted to use Raoul Wallenberg as some kind of bargaining chip, or wanted to explore what kind of information he possessed. So it's not entirely clear.
At what point did it become obvious that A. Wallenberg was taken by the Soviets and B. he was not likely to be released?
It was not very clear what had happened to Raoul Wallenberg. At first, there were all sorts of rumors about, where he could have, what could have transpired. For example, that he was murdered, or that he was a victim of, some kind of, um, military action, that he was, killed on the way to the Soviet headquarters. But at the same time, there were also serious indications that he, like other foreign diplomats, could have been detained. And in fact, the Swedish side had a sort of receipt from the Soviet side, the so-called Dekhanosov note, which was issued in December of 1944, that said that Wallenberg had been encountered and his property and his person were placed under Soviet protection. So this was a very strong indication that he was most likely taken to Russia and was in Soviet custody.
At what point, or if at all, did anyone from the international community, whether Sweden or the United States or anyone else, started expressing concerns or asking questions?
Well, of course, concerns about Wallenberg were, there almost from the beginning, although immediately after his disappearance, there were greater concerns about his colleagues, because at least the Swedish side had learned from the Soviets that they had met Raoul Wallenberg, that they had, placed him in protective custody. So, but once his colleagues returned to Stockholm in April 1945, Then, of course, people really, and especially his family, became extremely worried because they thought that, of course, that he would join them, and in the return to Stockholm. When that did not happen, the Swedish side did try to, obtain some answers, but it was very curious because they never really asked for Raoul Wallenberg to be returned. They always asked, to provide some kind of information about where he had been encountered, and then slowly and almost within a few months of his disappearance, as early as December 1945, Swedish officials began to ask the Soviet side for confirmation that he was dead, because they thought that he might have been the victim of some kind of violence in Hungary. And there had been reports from a Soviet-controlled radio station in Hungary that he was murdered in outside of Budapest. So this is a curious thing, that the Swedish side, almost from the very beginning, about 3 times or 4 times in the first 18 months, asked the Soviet side to confirm that he was dead, rather than seeking full clarity about his whereabouts, especially since they had received this note saying that he was under Soviet protection.
So, was it because they really actually thought he was dead? Was it because he was inconvenient for some reason and they wanted him, and they kind of wanted it to remain that way, for people to believe that he was dead? Or was it because they were afraid to challenge the Soviets for whatever reason?
This is really getting to one of the remaining core issues in the Wallenberg case, because for many, many years, and I would say for decades, the general idea has been that the reason that Wallenberg could not be saved was really the result of the confluence of a whole set of unfortunate circumstances, like chaotic wartime conditions, individual incompetence, excessive fear of the Soviet Union, Wallenberg's position as a sort of an outsider in Swedish society. But what has emerged in recent years is that there appears to have been, in fact, a conscious decision to abandon Raoul Wallenberg. And what happened is that in 1946, Stalin actually signaled that he wished to normalize relations with with Sweden, and that if Sweden were to um, conclude a huge credit and trade agreement that was valued at the time about $300 million, which was enormous. It's about, in today's value, roughly $4 billion. If Sweden were to conclude such an agreement already by the end of 1946, favorable political conditions would be created. So this meant that the Swedes actually now had, an offer from Stalin, not directly, but still very clearly phrased, of a quid pro quo. If you conclude this trade agreement, relations will normalize, and there will be favorable political conditions. So under these circumstances, actually Sweden could have raised and should have raised the fate of Raoul Wallenberg. But the curious thing is that even when they concluded this trade agreement in due time at the end of 1946, they did not approach the Soviet side to provide clarity about Wallenberg. So this remains the core question. Why was Sweden's passivity so extreme, and why did it not avail itself of the opportunities that it clearly had in order to solve, what happened to their own diplomat?
Here's another question. If the Soviets had control of Wallenberg, why didn't they use him as a bargaining chip for whatever? And why didn't they at any point then quietly, if he did, die in their custody, why would they at some point not resolve that issue themselves? if only to put an end to speculation and gossip, and to say he's unfortunately encountered an accident, died from a disease, and here's his body.
I cannot really answer the question in full because we simply do not have enough information about the official Russian handling or Soviet handling, or what really transpired in these discussions, what really motivated Stalin's thoughts and ideas, because clearly this would have been Stalin's decision how to proceed. But at some point, Stalin clearly got the idea that the Swedish side was signaling very strongly that they were hoping for or asking for a confirmation that Raoul Wallenberg was dead. So we do not know how Stalin interpreted this.
Mhm.
But at the same time, once he had what he wanted, which was a trade agreement in 1946, the question then is if Raoul Wallenberg lost all his utility to the Soviets. They may have tried to recruit him to see if he would be willing to work for them, but then he was already obviously in some ways compromised because people would have known that he had been held prisoner in the Soviet Union. And so maybe it would have been much simpler to just say, okay, the Swedish side shows no interest in this man. And for us, he's just a burden. So it might just be, and you have to remember, they had not formally acknowledged that they were holding him in Moscow. They had said that they had put him under protection, but they had basically not said that he was, in custody in the Soviet Union. So what happened is in 1947, in August, they actually presented a note saying that Wallenberg was unknown to them and was not in the Soviet Union. So this is how they tried to solve the case. They tried to say, we never made it to Moscow, we never held him, and that's it.
Did the United States put out any search for him at the time, or did it try to distance itself from the case?
Well, American involvement would have been very complicated, but of course there's much to be said that Wallenberg, of course, also represented American interests and was working on the Americans' behalf. So the Americans should have made a much stronger case and acted much more decisively on his behalf. The problem is that he was, of course, a Swedish citizen. And at the same time, there were already tensions between the Soviet Union and the Americans. So the question was for the American side and for the Swedish government whether or not a strong advocacy by the Americans on Wallenberg's behalf would be useful or would actually be, constitute a risk for him. And at the time, the Americans did offer their assistance, but it was more or less rejected by the Swedish side. And that is a very interesting chapter in itself because there are also many questions remain about why exactly they did not accept American assistance.
So that was then, but decades have passed since the time. Why hasn't there been a more concerted pressure to gain that information? I'm sure the family certainly wanted to know. The survivors probably wanted to know. The people he helped to rescue. Um, why didn't Sweden come forward and accept U.S. assistance at a later point after the initial circumstances concerning the business deal with the Soviet Union uh, went into the background?
Well, again, it's a very complicated and complex issue because Sweden was, of course, neutral, whereas the Americans and the Soviets were, opponents during the Cold War. So, Sweden always had the position that Wallenberg is a Swedish citizen, so he is their concern primarily. And whether or not they could have made increased use of American assistance is a topic that I think needs to be examined in greater detail. Towards the 1970s and early 80s, it became clear that the Wallenberg case was of interest to the Americans also as a way to as a tool of propaganda in their fight against communism, fight against the Soviet Union. So President Reagan made Wallenberg an honorary citizen in the United States, the first one after Winston Churchill in 1981. That, of course, then brought the Wallenberg case to much broader international attention. So there was additional pressure. American officials also worked very much behind the scenes during the 1980s, and especially during the period of glasnost and perestroika, when it became obvious that if the political and economic relations with the Soviet Union and the West were going to move ahead, then some of these very pressing historical issues, including the fate of dissidents, the question of human rights, would have to be addressed. And so there were attempts to smooth the way and to apply pressure on the Soviet side to provide more information. And this resulted in 1989 in an invitation by Mikhail Gorbachev to Wallenberg's family to come to Moscow, because they said at the time they had by accident discovered some of Raoul Wallenberg's belongings in the KGB archive, which is a very questionable claim, because actually there are indications that the preparation for this visit, started much earlier, was really ongoing for months, if not years. But so nevertheless, they tried to sort of, resolve the case by handing over his personal belongings, by admitting that he had been in the Soviet Union. They had done so first in 1957. They had announced that he had supposedly died already in 1947, suddenly as a result of a heart attack in his prison cell. But they had not offered any evidence. They had offered no death certificate. All they had offered was a note by some kind of doctor from the Lubyanka medical services. So there were a lot of questions, there were a lot of doubts, there were witness testimonies who said that they had heard of or encountered Wallenberg in Soviet imprisonment after 1947. So in 1989, they tried to put all these rumors to rest. They tried to say, here, he was here, but we have no further information, and please accept this. And of course, the family was not satisfied, because there was still no clear evidence of his death, and there was no indication really what had happened to him. So they insisted that they wanted to know the full truth and the full circumstances of Wallenberg's death. So then Wallenberg's brother actually created an international commission that for the first time actually gained access to some archives, some highly sensitive archives in Russia, including those of the KGB. And the result of this was that they found actual confirmation that Wallenberg had been imprisoned in Lubyanka prison. They found prison registers. They found entries in some of the cellmates of some of the files of Wallenberg's cellmates. And the result was that the KGB immediately closed down the access to this kind of documentation. But then they actually managed to get access to some of the other prison records and archives, especially also a famous isolated prison where Wallenberg had been reportedly seen or heard of, called Vladimir Prison, which is about 150 kilometers outside of Moscow. And the commission, this first commission, managed to actually review a lot of these, prisoner registry and prisoner cards, which was really groundbreaking research and access at the time.
So what happened once they started getting that confirmation that he had been moved to another prison outside Lubyanka? Did that prompt either the Soviet authorities or the Swedish government or anybody at all to start raising more public questions and comments about this?
They had found confirmation that Wallenberg was held in two prisons, in Lefortovo and in Lubyanka. There had been reports that he had also possibly been in this,
Mm.
isolated prison called uh, Vladimir prison, but there was no confirmation that he had ever been taken there. But what happened is that the the working group and the investigation was not able to confirm any of the testimonies that had talked about Wallenberg's survival in the Soviet Union after 1947. There, it was, we were able to confirm a lot of information about his stay in Moscow, about his being interrogated in Moscow, but it appears that he was not formally charged or sentenced, and his trail breaks off, his official trail breaks off in the Lubyanka prison in the spring of 1947. But what happened is that as late as 2009, after the working group had already disbanded and we decided to keep up an exchange and conversation with the FSB archive to ensure to be sure that we would fill in some of the gaps of the official case records, because we had in the working group not access in a lot of cases to the original documentation. For example, we had only been allowed to see copies of the prison registers, and these were also heavily censored. So the Russian side had consistently refused researchers access to these original prison registers. Well, as it turned out, we received information from the FSB Central Archive in 2009 that an so far unidentified numbered prisoner, prisoner number 7, was interrogated for 16 hours in Lubyanka prison, and who the Russian side said was based on circumstantial evidence identical with Raoul Wallenberg, because this prisoner number 7 was interrogated together with Raoul Wallenberg's driver, Wilmor Schlangfelder, who had been arrested together with him. And uh, so this would suggest that Raoul Wallenberg could have been alive 6 days after his official death date. And this information really was withheld by the Russian side for decades. And they did not share it with the working group. And this is, of course, a very serious issue, because this information should have immediately become public and should have been made available to researchers and to Wallenberg's family, but it was not. So this remains one of the main questions. Why did the Russians lie for decades about this? Why did they withhold this information? And that remains one of the most serious issues. And Soviet officials or Russian officials later on actually confirmed to Swedish officials that prisoner number 7 was identical with Raoul Wallenberg. But this information was not shared with Wallenberg's family. So there are a lot of questions that still remain, and there has to be a way to formally confirm or deny whether this prisoner number 7 was identical with Raoul Wallenberg. But the circumstances, in fact, appear to point to this high likelihood that Wallenberg was in fact held as a numbered prisoner and was held 6 days after his official death date. Now, the Russian side basically says, well, it doesn't matter if we withheld this information. It doesn't matter if we lied about it, that Wallenberg was alive. It doesn't matter that the official Soviet version of his fate in Russia is not the truth, because Wallenberg died sometime in 1947 anyway, and we have no documentation that could shed light on the full circumstances of his fate. And despite the fact that the Russian side has consistently lied since 1945, has consistently withheld crucial information, has consistently omitted important information, and the fact that there are strong indications that they hold much more relevant material still in their archives that was not shared and not available to investigators during the 1990s, the Swedish side has essentially accepted the Russian position that Wallenberg most likely died in 1947 and that there's nothing else to be done. So Swedish investigators have essentially stopped any kind of official inquiry in the Wallenberg case.
Why would that be? Especially after considering that, since 2008, Russia resumed a very aggressive posture on the international stage and clearly became a threat.
Well, it's very odd that once Sweden actually received the most sensational piece of information in the Wallenberg case since 1945, they did not enthusiastically and energetically pursue this information and actually confront the Russians by saying, look, this appears you have not been telling us the full story for all these years, and especially during a 10-year-long investigation in the working group where, we spent considerable time, energy, and money on trying to determine what happened, and yet a crucial piece of information was not shared. But what happened is in 2009, it appears that Sweden and Russia were far more interested in expanding their bilateral economic and political relations. And as I said, they had adopted this position that the information didn't matter because Wallenberg could not, could not be determined what happened to him, and he died anyway. But the Russian side, of course, did not offer any evidence for their claim that he died anyway. And given the fact that the Swedish side now had very strong indications that Wallenberg almost certainly outlived his official death date and that the official version of his fate was not true, they should have really pushed very hard. And it shows that, in fact, the full truth about Raoul Wallenberg did not matter so much anymore at that time. That it seems clear that both sides were really quite happy to settle for an incomplete solution. And that is, of course, very unfortunate.
What would have been the repercussion of sharing all of Wallenberg's fate? Let's say turns out that he was died in prison under less than fortunate circumstances. Either he was formally executed, died of an illness, died under torture, whatever the case may be. Let's say the Soviet Union or Russia released that information. What would have been the likely impact?
Well, it's very difficult to understand that if the Russian side really has no further information, why they would have felt the need to obscure, to hide this fact that Wallenberg most likely was interrogated 6 days after his date of death. They could have made this information available to the working group and said, it appears that the earlier versions are not quite true. This is the last known trace of him in Soviet captivity. We have no further information, but here are the facts of what we know. Then that would have made sense. This does not make sense, other than that the Russian side basically did not want to, bother with any kind of unpleasant publicity that the former version of their story was not true. So this is one explanation. And in terms of the Swedish side, it's very strange because they too seem to have been accepting of the idea that the Wallenberg case could not be solved precisely at the moment when it was becoming clear that this Russian side had very crucial and relevant information. And it seems that the Russian side has not only withheld this information, but also other important archival collections that were not shared, that were not fully accessible, that were not we were not able to review. For the Swedish side, of course, if Wallenberg died after 1947, if he lived for some years, this would, of course, again raise a lot of questions about Swedish actions in the case, the failure to decisively pursue his fate, especially in these very early years of 1945-47. But the Swedish investigation of the case, for example, in 2003, the commission that investigated the official handling of the Swedish side of the Wallenberg question came to the conclusion that it didn't matter what Sweden did because Raoul Wallenberg was doomed from the moment of his arrest. They had actually claimed that Stalin never showed any kind of interest in negotiating or making any kind of concessions to Sweden. So even if Sweden behaved deplorably, even if there were crucial failures, even if the passivity was extreme and not explained, it didn't matter because Wallenberg was doomed. And this, of course, now has really been shown to be not the case. This is clearly not what happened, because Stalin did, in fact, offer a quid pro quo, and the Swedish side did not react. And even when this huge trade deal was concluded, they did not inquire. They asked for him to be declared dead. So this is really the crucial question on the Swedish side. Why was Raoul Wallenberg expendable? Why was he almost from the start consciously abandoned? This question has not been answered in 80 years.
So let me ask this. What happened to Wallenberg's driver who was interrogated at the same time as he was?
Well, he was also detained. Vilmos Langfelder was a Hungarian citizen. He was a Jew who had been part of the Hungarian labor service and was then received protective papers from the Swedish legation and became Raoul Wallenberg's driver in November 1944. And he was really in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he was detained together with Raoul Wallenberg. It's not exactly known what happened to him. His files also have not been discovered, but there are some indication that he died or was killed sometime in 1948.
So, in other words, he was not released, so it was not possible to question him whether the person interrogated with him was in fact Wallenberg.
Yes, that was not possible. And also, he had a cellmate, a longtime cellmate called Sándor Katona. He too was interrogated on that day, and at the same time, he too was not released. And the Soviet state security services went through great lengths to try to isolate all the people who had been in contact with Raoul Wallenberg for some years after this crucial period of July 1947.
Where would that be, do you think? Especially if it's possible that he was later still alive and transferred to a prison. What is it about that period and that questioning that they were trying to hide, and why?
Well, I think they had settled on this idea that they were going to deny that Raoul Wallenberg was ever held a prisoner in the Soviet Union. So this was a way to try to make it feasible for them to deny any knowledge of him and claim that he had already been murdered in Hungary. His this longtime cellmate, a German diplomat by the name of Willy Rödel, also did not survive. He appears to have been killed in late 1947.
So, in other words, they were tying in all the loose ends to make sure that nothing got out.
Yes, they were definitely trying to do that, but the question still remains if Wallenberg really lost all his utility, or if Stalin may have wanted to hang on to him for a little while, especially since he must have received the impression that the Swedish side was not too keen or not interested in his return. So we really do not know what happened at this crucial moment. But there's only so many possibilities. He could have been killed. He could have remained under investigation for some time, or he could have been charged and sentenced and transferred to a punishment prison or a camp.
Mm-hmm.
So but the onus, I always would like to stress, is that the onus of this to, to clarify what happened is squarely on the Russian side. They still have not provided access to some of the key records, like these registers in Lubyanka. They have not provided access to key investigative files of Wallenberg's fellow prisoner. We still don't have some of the documentation that shows the genesis of some of the key documents that were created and show the official handling and the official thinking behind the handling of the Wallenberg case. So all of this is, it's not that progress cannot be made, but it's simply a claim that they have no more relevant records. And of course, this is their claim, but we cannot, we don't have access to the documentation that we need to see. In our discussions with Russian officials, they have provided some materials, but they have not provided access to the key materials, and that is the problem.
So that brings me to the next point, which is the workings of the Swedish-Russian group and the relationship with the KGB and the structure that was going on, how we were able to obtain any material at all, and why did they decide to provide you with some but not not everything? What was the whole point of the group if it was never going to, resolve anything really?
Well, it's let me say, I think it was not entirely what you would call a play for the gallery,
Mm-hmm.
but of course, the whole setup of this investigation raises some questions about what the intent was. On the Russian side, it was very clear that they wanted to keep the investigation as limited as possible. They said very clearly that it's clear that Wallenberg died in 1947, so they were only going to address the issue within this rather narrow framework. Now, the Swedish side faced the challenge that, they wanted to, of course, try to get as much information as possible. At the same time, it's very clear that the investigation from the start was characterized by an inherent conflict of interest, because Swedish officials, really their main aim was to solve the case just to the point where it could be removed from the official Swedish-Russian agenda so that relations could move ahead. So that was the priority. That doesn't mean that Swedish officials privately were not interested in trying to maximize their efforts or interested in Wallenberg's fate, but the official agenda set by this by the Swedish side and by the Russian side was to solve the case so that it could, to the point that it could be removed, and so that it would not constitute an obstacle between the two countries anymore. For Wallenberg's family and the researchers, the aim was, of course, to establish the full circumstances of what happened to Wallenberg. So this created, from the very start, these were not the same priorities, and that had certain consequences. Also, on the Swedish side, there was a certain kind of hierarchy between researchers and Swedish officials. Swedish officials had access, more direct access to certain kind of records that researchers did not have access to. And this created a problem, because if you do not have, as you know yourself, if researchers cannot review records in uncensored form or in context, then the evaluation and assessment is limited. It's clear that there had to be compromises because, of course, the Russian side, the KGB, and then later the FSB, was, of course, not going to allow direct access to its archival collections, but they, of course, shared some records. But as I said, the access was limited. And then we had some we were allowed to review some very important documentation in the original, like I mentioned already, the very important and groundbreaking research in Vladimir prison, the review of the original prisoner cards, the whole prisoner card registry. That was an enormous project that yielded a lot of interesting information, but we were not allowed to review documentation that really then could provide crucial additional information like internal correspondence records and internal prison records, discussions between the prison administration and the headquarters in Moscow that would really show what kind of system was in place to track prisoners, what information they were receiving about incoming and outgoing prisoners, how they were tracing prisoners within their prison on a daily basis. All of this we did not have. The internal administrative documentation from the MGB, some, the files of the section chiefs of the MGB, which had certain instructions. All of these records we are not able to review. So there are truly really glaring gaps in the records that remain.
Were there any intelligence professionals working with the Swedish Russian groups on the Swedish side?
There were not, this is another issue. The official members of the working group were really people who were not, they did not have a background history or historical investigation. That does not mean that we were not providing interesting and qualified research, but the problem is that there were no official Swedish historians associated with the working group in an official way. There were individuals who were, of course, consulted along the way, but they were not, this was not sort of a coordinated, systematic effort that brought together, intelligence professionals, historians, researchers, etc. And this, of course, was another problem because this kind of expertise that would have been readily available, where you would have been able to really create a comprehensive approach, that never really happened. Another issue is also on the Swedish side. We did not have access to some very important documentation. There's some records that remain fully classified to this day. For example, just recently we learned that the longtime Swedish ambassador to Moscow, Rolf Sohlman, who he played a crucial role in the Wallenberg investigation after 1945, that during the 1960s, he had a very, sort of confidential back channel to the Soviet leadership. And this back channel turned out to be one of the KGB's most notorious counterintelligence officers. So this means that the conversations between these two men would have generated an enormous set of records, hundreds, if not thousands of pages in the KGB archive. Before, what we knew was that this confidential contact that this ambassador Rolf Sohlman, had, that he was some kind of retired academic who claimed that he had direct contact to the Soviet leadership, including Nikita Khrushchev and all of this. So the idea was that these materials or the records of these conversations would be stored or would surface in the archives of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, as it turns out, since this contact was, a top-level KGB officer, it is very clear that this material is not duplicated in any other archive, but that it sits in the KGB records held at the FSB archive, and that we never knew about them, did not have access to them, and most importantly, that these thousands of pages contain crucial background about the Wallenberg case, because this is what these men discussed for more than 4 years.
What was the official Swedish excuse for not doing doing the job that was needed? How did they justify all of this to the public, to the family?
Well, the investigation went on for 10 years. So it's, in fairness, we have to say that Swedish officials, had to navigate a very complex situation. I mean, the Russian side was cooperative, but of course, also very difficult to deal with. Uh, the knowledge about Soviet era archives was limited. What we know now is light years more than what we knew at the beginning of this process. So the problem is that in many ways the Swedish approach remained very narrow and limited. And the fact that it was structured, that the work of the working group was structured in the way that it was, turned out to be really highly problematic, because this failure to access original documentation, especially those of the most centrally important records like prison registers, turned out to be really fateful, because as a result, the Russian side was able to withhold absolutely crucial information, that we only learned of 10 years after the end of the working group. If we had learned of this from the very beginning, the whole direction of the Wallenberg investigation would have been a different one.
So that brings me to the information warfare aspect of this whole situation, which is very clearly this case became sort of a bone in the throat of the international community over time. And yet, the Soviet Union slash later Russia have not only not done anything to put this issue to rest for real and to come clean and to sort of take responsibility for the historic past and move on, but on the contrary, used it as a sort of dangle that they on the one hand try to whitewash their own record, on the other hand try to gain additional concessions from Sweden. So the question is, how is it that this did not become blatantly obvious to everybody else who was involved aside from Sweden? And why wasn't there more concerted international pressure to prevent Russia from using historical records in such a blatantly dishonest manner?
It's a very difficult question to answer, because on the Russian side, we had a very, very limited period where it was really possible to make progress. If you remember, already by 1993, Russia passed already a law on state secrets. So even though the Soviet Union collapsed, the power of the KGB was really preserved. And also the thinking and the mentality of the state security services was preserved. It was always focused on making sure that no criticism or no failures or abuses of the state security services would be revealed, or would be revealed, but if so, in a limited way. And you can see that Putin slowly but surely tried more and more and more to control the historical narrative of the history of the state security services and of Stalinism in general. You can see it in the work of the Historical Society. You can see it in the manipulation of textbooks, of history books, of how Stalin's crimes have been downplayed and his role as victor of the great patriotic war has been emphasized. So the Swedish side had to deal and had to navigate with all of this. And at the same time, clearly on the Swedish side, and also possibly on the Western side as such, meaning the United States, Britain, and other countries, there was also great concern to avoid any kind of collateral damage. That historical investigation always bears the risk of turning up all kinds of other, sensitive issues. On the Swedish side, for example, there is this issue of other Swedes who were imprisoned in the Soviet Union, individuals whose fate may not be known, or even the fact that they had been detained was not known. When we started working in the working group, we had a very, very limited sense of this issue. Only later on did we realize that there were actually between 500 and 1,000 other Swedish citizens imprisoned in the Soviet Union after World War II. But we were not, since we didn't know about them, this really posed a huge problem, because every time, for example, Raoul Wallenberg's brother heard about an old Swede in Magadan, he assumed that this had to be his brother. This had to be his, that there was no other possibility. And then we slowly learned that, this could have been very well another Swede. Had we known about this, we could have, of course, saved a lot of energy, time, money, and could have conducted a much more efficient and effective investigation. So there are a lot of issues where we can say this was really, there were a lot of things that could have been handled much better. And this is one of the really serious failures, because this lack of information and lack of a really truly systematic approach really hampered the effectiveness of this overall investigative effort.
All of this brings up a lot of really disturbing broader questions beyond the specifics of this horrible, tragic situation, which is the general implications for human rights defenders worldwide. If this is what can happen to somebody, and if their governments are not then going to go out on the limb to protect them, or to at least find out what happened, why would anyone want to enter this field?
Well, the lesson of the Wallenberg case are, of course, there are quite a few. There are many. Both, I mean, both aspects of his legacy, both as a hero of the Holocaust and as a victim of repression and political prisoner. I'm always, as I think I've said before, I'm always hesitant to tell young people to emulate Raoul Wallenberg, or to, follow in his footsteps, because the price of activism, as we can see and as we know, can be very high. And Wallenberg was no exception. So while we, of course, want to teach our children to, stand up for the truth and to help other people to come to their aid, I always feel that we also have to make sure that we give them a good sense of reality. What can happen when you do? It can happen that nobody comes to your aid. And so this is, in a way, also what we see today, because what Wallenberg really showed is this principled defense of human rights. That is really his legacy. And there is really a direct line between what happened to him and the situation we see today in Russia, for example, political prisoners who are imprisoned as a direct result of their activism. The line between Raoul Wallenberg and prisoners of today there's a direct line. This connection is not, it's not abstract, it's tangible, it's real, it's manifest. And that the need to protect human rights, but also human rights defenders, that we must find a way to, we have managed to hold human rights violators accountable, but we have not done a good job of protecting human rights defenders.
Mm-hmm.
And that really needs to change. That is really the lesson, because the idea that each person matters, that is the most profound, that is the core that represents the core of Wallenberg's mission, but it's also the core of any kind of democratic system, democratic values. And this is, if we fail in that, if we fail in a principled defense of human rights and individuals who are standing up for these values, then we are allowing the gradual erosion of our democratic values. And that is one of the most fateful failures that we can have.
So what we've seen in this case is that political and commercial interests trumped these human rights concerns, and we are seeing that once again, truth became sacrificed in defense of whatever behind the scenes agreements between Soviet Union slash Russia and Sweden. Today we are seeing the situation being replicated with Ukraine. Not only are thousands of people disappearing and being moved from Ukraine to Russia and then disappearing under unclear circumstances, but there's banking going on from European countries continuing to fund the Russian war. There's all sorts of interests that are being prioritized over Russia's human rights and war crimes. Human rights abuses and war crimes. So it doesn't seem like the Wallenberg case is unique. If anything else, it's been scaled up to manifold, even on a concerning regular people who become victims of these mass repressions and mass atrocities. So, is there any way to make the case relevant, given that human nature is such that commercial and political interests and campaigns seem to be paramount to anything else?
Well, as we have seen now in recent years, I mean, democracy is sort of an endangered species, and it has come to the point that even some people question the inherent value of democracy, or even going so far to blame various social ills and various problems in the world on democracy itself. And I think we have to really fight that trend, because democracy certainly is not blameless, and it has had many lapses. We have talked the talk, but not walked the walk. We have not stuck to our principles, and particularly in our business practices. We have behaved in very pragmatic ways and very abusive ways. But democracy has an enormous inherent power. It has an enormously important message, which is that in democracies, if you look at what sets democracy apart from totalitarianism, it is how it defines the interests and the well-being of individuals versus the overarching interests of the state. So the fundamental principle defense of individual lives, individual citizens matters. And that is really an incredibly powerful message, because in democracies, democracies value their citizens first and foremost. Autocratic systems really care only about themselves and their cronies. And that is really an incredibly powerful message. And this is something that we should really hold on to. And when we look at Ukraine, this is really what we are defending. We are defending the value of every human being. Democracies stumble and fall and fail and have lots of issues that they could do better. We have had horrible abuses in the name of democracy, in the name of profits, pursuit of profits, but it still remains the most humane system that humanity has produced, in the sense that if it sticks to its principles and values. And that's why I think Wallenberg's example is so important, because here is a man who stood up in a principled defense of human rights, and in what he represented and what he did was really pure humanistic philosophy in action. He showed empathy and compassion, and what was at the core of his mission, that is that every human being matters. And that is really the most crucial lesson. And that is also, so for me, I try to stay away from too much cynicism, because cynicism will lead to inaction. Wallenberg is the positive example for positive action, and it shows what can be done when you have a person who puts his mind to, to this kind of endeavor.
That leads me to believe. I mean, we are seeing authoritarian regimes and movements thrive all over the world. We are seeing relatively little limited pushback to all of this. Do you think the legacy of Wallenberg has been just basically put aside? Is has it become nothing more than a talking point?
Well, possibly for some people, because there's also this sort of, performative, ritualistic, form of remembrance. And remembrance is very, very important. But so is historic truth, because only with historic truth, only if you have facts can you have sort of, democracy relies on reliable information in order to be able to arrive at informed decisions. And if we are seeing now what happens when you are tampering with facts, when you feel that when there's, when lie becomes truth, etc. So then you don't have any kind of shared reality, you don't have any kind of shared values, and you cannot arrive at any kind of set of universal values, universal beliefs, which is really sort of the precept of the United Nations, for example. And if you don't have that, then you don't have accountability, and the rule of law is in question, and ultimately you don't have justice. So Wallenberg's mission, and Wallenberg in a way is the antithesis to all of this, because his case, what you need is, you need remembrance, but you also need historic truth, because only then can you learn from your mistakes and you can learn from history. That is what enables our learning from history. And so that's why I always feel that it's important to ensure that we are remembering his dual legacy, not just in quotation mark his heroic actions as a, in defense of
Mhm.
human lives in Budapest, but as a hero of the Holocaust, but also as a victim of repression. That we insist on the truth, because insisting on the truth about one person is really a profoundly democratic act. It's an act of resistance to authoritarianism, because authoritarians want to just wipe out all kinds of all rights of individual citizens. They want to impose the authority over the state over the rights of their citizens. So emphasizing the importance of individual lives, the fate of individual citizens, is really the ultimate act of resistance and the ultimate democratic act. And this is exactly, again, the line between that connects the past with the present, that we are protecting individual human rights defenders. We are not protecting a concept, we are defending each and every person who is standing up for our shared values. And that is ultimately our shared humanity. And that is the only thing that will save us.
What was the Swedish government's reaction to your latest article exposing some of this cover-up and abandonment?
Well, I think we have in our project focused on trying to fill the gaps that exist in the official case record. And our position has been that we want to get away from speculation or any kind of, conspiracy theories. That's why I don't use the term cover up. Um,
Hmm.
it's really, for me, a question that we are able to learn the facts. If we, what I have a problem with and what I'm concerned about is if we stop short and say we cannot find the truth because we do not have the information. Well, in some cases that is true, but there's also still a lot of information that is available in Swedish archives and in Russian archives. And we have just now learned, as I explained earlier, as I referenced earlier, from some previously classified material in Swedish sources that has led us to this realization that there's a whole trove of records in the KGB archives that deals with nothing but the background of Raoul Wallenberg's fate. It must contain, you know, background memos. It must, ref, re, assessments, correspondence, instructions, etc., etc. So there's a whole set of records that must contain extremely valuable information and potential clues about Wallenberg's fate. So this material is available and should be available, but nobody has access to it. So for me, the question really is, are we going to be willing to avail ourselves of the avenues that we do have? And when we don't, then I feel that there is a reluctance to pursue certain kind of lines of questioning. So many, many questions remain on the Swedish side of the case and on the Russian side of the case, and also in all three phases of the Wallenberg case, his background, his contacts and activities in Hungary, and his disappearance. So the Swedish side, how they have reacted to this is essentially clinging to this or staying with the idea that the Swedish side is the Swedish officials are no longer actively investigating the case because they have accepted the Russian claim that there is no more information and that uh, whatever information that we have learned about Wallenberg possibly living longer than his official death date does not matter because he died anyway. So there is very little interest in pursuing the issue further, and also no interest in fully answering the numerous background questions that remain.
What I find surprising is not so much the silence of the Swedish government, but the silence of the human rights community in general, relatively speaking, concerning this issue and many other related issues. Do you think the human rights industrial complex has become corrupted or hijacked by some alternative agendas to their original mission?
Well, that's an evening filling conversation. I cannot fully answer that in just a few sentences. But the problem is, of course, that this is considered a historical case. And I always have emphasized that the issues at the heart of this case are as current as they were 80 years ago, especially investigation of Wallenberg's fate, because it goes to the issue of freedom of information, access to information, right to the truth, protection of individuals from arbitrary detention and forced disappearance and torture. So this is not like an isolated time capsule somewhere 8 decades removed. These issues are, we are grappling with today in just a different setting with different names. So I think there's a tendency, of course, a human rights organization and human rights advocates have to, of course, focus on the living and the people that they can save now. Wallenberg clearly is no longer alive. But there is, in my view, a problem in terms of pursuing cases again as a matter of principle. The Swedish side could take a very simple position that it could take a very principled position. It could say, this was one of ours. He was a Swedish diplomat. He vanished in the course of an official task, carrying out an official task on behalf of the Swedish state. We consider his case open and active until we know the truth. This would it would cost Sweden nothing to do so. And yet the sort of the reaction is, or sort of the instinctive reaction is to say, okay, this is now done. We are not officially pursuing this case anymore. It's a historic matter. And in terms of what human rights organizations or how they pursue certain investigations or advocacy today is what I worry about is that as the world is changing and as authoritarian governments become more powerful and more influential, as we can see in the UN, the whole UN process is essentially hijacked and broken. Our advocacy models have not kept pace. We are still pursuing very similar, very outdated ways of advocacy. We're still turning to the United Nations. We're still turning to entities like the EU, even though they're losing more and more effectiveness because they're more and more intent on sort of accommodating, finding ways to accommodate authoritarian regimes because as they become more powerful, as we see with China, for example.
Mhm.
So I worry that we are not effective in our advocacy and that it becomes, again, a sort of a ritualistic and performative strategy where we sort of write letters and make statements. It's sort of this kind of hashtag advocacy that doesn't really have any meaning. There have been some attempts like, for example, the idea behind Magnitsky sanctions, that you hold human rights violators directly accountable. That process also has now, lost some of its effectiveness as autocratic governments feel more confident that they can ignore sanctions because there are numerous ways of of avoiding sanctions and evading sanctions, and monitoring and enforcement of sanctions has not kept pace. So there is this tendency to just be self-satisfied with imposing Magnitsky sanctions, and you're saying, well, these people are on the sanctions list, but does it have actual meaning? What is the actual effects? And so I think we need to really become much more aware and also much more self-critical in terms of how we are going about our advocacy for human rights, how effective it is, and what we can do to change it, because the autocrats at the moment are outpacing us, and that's a very disturbing state of affairs.
All right, I see two mechanisms through which they're accomplishing. One, economics, by being built up, as economic powerhouses with a lot to invest, and either directly as a state or through oligarchs and other structures, they're basically feeding into the weakening economies of European or Western states, or just basic greed for foreign investments in political corruption and bribery. The other issue is information warfare, basically um, exploiting distrust into the local authorities, expertise, media, governments, whatever, to basically spread narratives that hijack any sort of value system, and also exploring ignorance of history, ignorance of basic ethics, and lack of rudimentary ethical underpinnings. So these two issues, I mean, it's ironic because some of them have worked for decades to take over academia, to take over public institutions, soft power institutions, and then they claim that the West is corrupt when they were the ones corrupting it all along.
Well, the problem is that the West, the democracy has an aspect that is its greatest asset and it's also its greatest weakness because carries within itself, it's probably the only system that allows its its own mechanisms for its own destructions to flourish. We allow individuals to exploit our system to create the mechanisms for our own destruction, as we see, because we allow free speech, we do not want to restrict um, speech or forms of expression, even though it is, as you say, disinformation and promotes outright lies and false narratives that actually lead to the very actions and scenarios that have now resulted in the rise of the defeat of democratic institutions, or the sort of sowed doubts about the value of our own democratic system. And this is, I think, the only thing that we can do is that we as democracies have to have a much more muscular defense of our own system. And this in terms of also how we behave, because democracies have lost a lot of credibility and we have a lot to answer for, that's for sure. But it doesn't mean that democratic systems or democracies are helpless or defenseless. But we're going to have to find a way to stay true to our principles, because when we do, democracy is an enormously attractive force. And it has incredibly hidden powers. You can see the force, the beauty of democracy and the power it has on the human spirit in Georgia. Everybody wants to go to one, everybody wants to live in one, everybody wants to have a life with dignity and have their own say about their own lives. So if we can tap into that, then this will be a force to be reckoned with. There was an interesting report recently that the Iranian government fears most of all this spirit of resistance of this young democratic movement,
Mm-hmm.
and civil dissent and civil uprising. So there is this urge of human beings to be free, to determine their own lives, to not be under the force of, not to be told what to do, what to be, how to behave, and to have this control over over every aspect of their lives, is such an enormous power that if we learn to harness it, and if we find a way to actually stay true to our principles as we state them and not compromise them, then I think we have really, that is the best way to counter these authoritarian tendencies.
So that raises another question. Are there any possibilities of more clear and more and better enforced accountability measures? And for instance, how do we address some of the contemporary hostage-related policies and bills, given the fact that some of these issues are still ongoing. People are still being taken hostage, used as political pawns all over the world. And for instance, the U.S. just had a group of detained citizens released from Venezuela, but in exchange for renewing an oil license that ensures the political survival of the very regime the same administration had earlier decided is not cannot be held legitimate. So we're de facto providing a lifeline to the government's regimes we don't find legitimate and giving them that de facto legitimacy in spite of ourselves. How do we avoid that? How do we avoid incentivizing hostage taking other than outright banning citizens from traveling to those countries, which has been done with North Korea, for instance, and probably should be done more often, but at the end of the day, it hasn't been done for whatever reason.
Well, deterrence is, of course, a very important issue that we have to educate citizens and that they have to take responsibility not to travel and expose themselves to these risks. Another is that we have to really ensure that countries who engage in these activities really pay a draconian price, that there's real life consequences if you are engaging in these activities, that you must then be facing some very serious consequences. That has not really, we have not really been able to agree, as an international community on really a set of really consequential measures, and that has to happen. And another thing is that we really also have to educate our own public that democracy and freedom is not free, that there is going to be a cost. If we are going to successfully oppose some of these authoritarian regimes, the first thing, for example, we have to potentially stop trading. Like Germany is still, one of Iran's biggest trading partners, even though we had hostages in Iran. So if we believe in engagement and in trade and the value of trade and value of these kind of relationships. However, there comes a point where potentially we have to incur a cost if we're going to hold China accountable. We must be aware that there would be some consequences. And so far, governments have tried very much to avoid these kind of consequences for their citizens, because anything that affects travel or accessibility of certain kind of goods, because of course the people in charge are also politicians, so they feel there's a political cost involved. And it's the same with kind of, we all want to have a reasonable price for our iPhones. Well, we have to potentially face the fact that we must, realize that we may not be able to consume as the lower prices that we're used to, if we are going to mount a serious defense of our system of democracy. So that to me is the fundamental lesson, and that has not happened. I can see it, for example, in Europe. I mean, Europeans sort of talk about certain the rise of authoritarianism, but they're very complacent. They're very set in their ways. They think that the world will continue as it is. They have very little awareness of the complexity of supply lines, and sooner or later it will hit them. And this realization, I think the governments are not doing a good job of preparing their population for these kind of consequences and for the need to rethink how we are living.
I mean, recently there was a German Iranian dual national who was executed in Iran, and also a Swedish Iranian dual national who was sentenced to death. I think there was someone else who was found dead, or I don't know the full details of every case, but the German dual national was also a resident of the United States, and his family was, his daughter was here. All of these horrible situations were met with muted response from the governments and resulted in no diplomatic damage to Iran whatsoever. Iran did not suddenly become a pariah state. There was no breakdown in diplomatic relations. Iranian officials are still traveling to international fora. They're still part of the international community, and they're still taking part in the Human Rights Council, even chairing it. So how can we talk about any real accountability or any serious measures when it's not just it's what is done is insufficient, but that nothing is being done, and these regimes actually are rewarded for their bad behavior? They're rewarded with political concessions, with the outright bribes, and with business as usual. And they are welcomed, and their investments are welcomed, and their money is welcomed, and their propagandists are welcomed.
This is what we were talking about before. We will need to change our behavior. We will need to make adjustments. You know, John Le Carre once said that the problem is that we essentially go everywhere and anywhere for money. And this is true. So unless we are willing to really make a decision and stop this kind of behavior, that we actually say no every once in a while, and that we enact measures that really have meaning, and that we actively oppose and say that we are not going to comply with this kind, or even advance this kind of behavior or enable this kind of behavior. And this will require a really serious rethinking also of our business practices. And our business practices are essentially pragmatic and amoral because they're driven by supply and demand.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, any kind of moral or ethical considerations really have to come to bear from the people who are carrying out and concluding these deals. And this requires really a fundamental realignment, but also of our thinking, because we have to realize that we will not be able to import all goods. We will have to pay higher prices for energy, for transportation, for electronics. But you know, if we want to preserve the way of life that we are used to in terms of our civil liberties,
Mm-hmm.
then that is the price we will have to pay. But if we don't, then we will end up in a similar situation. You saw how quickly civil liberties were eroded in Russia, to the point that, you know, the state apparatus of control and repression is now so severe that people do not even dare to uh, say even the slightest thing that could be interpreted as dissent or criticism of the regime. Then we are silenced. And we are heading in that direction, and we better stop the trend.
So that leads me to the final issue here, which is post-Soviet geopolitical space and the persistence of narratives far from reforming. And we've seen that with some struggle, most of the Eastern Europe actually tried to break uh, from some of their Soviet tradition. The success was mixed, but Russia very quickly fell back into their old ways, and now the Soviet legacy is being resurrected. You see statues of Stalin popping up here and there. And while initially Putin's emphasis was on the Tsarist and imperial legacy of Russia, the Soviet traditions are also making a comeback. The praise of Soviet history is making a comeback, and that seems to not really, the ideological aspect of what is going on doesn't seem to kind of seep through to the West. They see the invasion of Ukraine, but they see it as some sort of a practical matter related to, you know, narratives related about NATO or geopolitics. They're not looking at the ideological specter of all of it and the driving roots and the fact that these ideological elements are feeding into popular support and feeding into this lack of resistance to authoritarianism. So, given the history, given what has happened, ha- isn't this a good time to start leveraging and pushing in every way, pushing back against these narratives, these falsehoods, this manipulation of both history and current realities? I mean, first of all, isn't it a time for to collectively start bringing up the Wallenberg case on its 80th anniversary to show the continuity in this sort of power obsessed security mentality that has nothing to do with individual leaders and everything has to do with this historical tradition of deceit that hasn't really broken this entire time? I mean, we never really won the Cold War if we are looking at this whole chain of events now.
Well, if we're starting now from the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the path that Russia took, I think there's, of course, the question of that the leadership of Russia did not want to change, that the structures of these security services were so strong that these structures were not broken, were not reformed, were not forced to disband. This is one aspect. The other aspect is that the West, in a way, did not offer Russia a very attractive alternative. That is potentially one of the issues that deserves more, more examination. I'm not, talking now about the narrative of NATO posing a threat to Russia, et cetera, et cetera. Those are really clearly, you know, Russian talking points. But the fact that there was this kind of idea that the West was superior and had now defeated Russia or the Soviet Union and had therefore shown um, its strength, and that it had established a superiority, and that Russia was ineffective and weak. And there was this idea of humiliation. And when you humiliate your opponent, then you create enormous resentment and you withdraw
It's
to.
possible, but I'm not entirely sure that the humiliation was really the aspect for it, because if you see who came to power in Russia, the oligarchs that ended up bringing Putin to power down the road, these people were very much opportunistically jumping on the fall of the Soviet Union. The one mistake US and others did was not insisting on holding the communist leadership accountable. But I don't see the humiliation because US and others ultimately sold off a lot of their own economic opportunities like uranium explanation to Russia. They forced Ukraine into a deal of destroying their nuclear weapons while Russia got to preserve their arsenal and be considered a great power. So where is the humiliation in that? I'm not entirely sure. Russia was able to enrich itself and to make deals, and they chose to misspend the funding not on building up strong infrastructure, but on oligarchs capitalizing on that, but that's not necessarily the West's fault. And I don't see where the humiliation is coming from. Russia was able to participate in international institutions like G20, and they were inside G8 for a while until they started blatantly violating international law. I'm not sure that this humiliation narrative adds up. I don't see where exactly is the humiliation. They didn't have to pay for anything to anybody. They didn't have to pay any reparations to anybody for the communist era or anything like that.
But I think there was this idea of system failure and system collapse. And there was, if I remember, in the 90s, there was true desperation. I mean, the living standards, you know, there was suffering in the, and this continues today, but in the civilian population. This was a humiliating experience in that sense that Russia was once a superpower, was perceived as a superpower.
Mm-hmm.
So it lost that status, and there was very little outreach from Western societies. Basically, it was a way, and again, the West is in a way to blame because we did not care about stopping oligarchs from gaining power. We enabled and fueled and benefited from
Sure.
their rise. And we made compromises. We turned a blind eye. Financial centers, New York, London, they did not care about the sources of the money. They just worked with it and used it. And enriched themselves and enriched the people and empowered the very people who had absolutely no interest in creating a more equitable, fair, just, democratic society. So it's sort of a mutually reinforcing downward spiral that when you basically cannibalize your country, that you cannot, this is not conducive to any kind of institution building. The focus was on rape and pillaging the assets. It
Mm-hmm.
was not, there was no focus on actually building any kind of society. And you have to think about the people who came to power. The people who came to power came out of an organization that was essentially a a mafia organization within the state. And what happened is that now the state became the mafia. And it basically is run like a criminal enterprise. So, in terms of this idea of narratives and that we have not held Russia accountable, that's true. But there was really no process at the time. There was no I did not see any evidence that the Russians themselves were interested in accountability and justice.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that the system never collapsed to the degree that people were in charge who would want to promote such an accounting. Because the state apparatus, even though it was the official structures, I mean, the Soviet structure as such was destroyed. The internal power structure remained with the intelligence and security services.
So where does it take us now? What is the direction, first of all, for the Wallenberg case itself, and second of all, for confronting these new realities, just as the march on, you know, is continuing? Yes, we are seeing some quasi-authoritarian leaders in Serbia, in Slovakia being either kicked out altogether or pressured, but overall, we're also seeing a lot of degradation of the public discourse, a lot of erasure of basic empathy, and a lot of sympathy for organized crime and for this sort of power-oriented culture. How can we resurrect this legacy in terms of making it more appealing and valuable to people? Because all I see is that the support for individualism, for the value of individual human rights, the more there is sympathy for authoritarian or power-focused politics, the less there's consideration for individual human rights and individuals in general.
Well, there is a sort of increasing coarseness of our discourse and our political structures and societal structures. And I think it starts with the idea of what do we want? Do we really feel that it is, we are harking back now with the ascent of Trump and the increasing authoritarian structures to survival of the fittest, the law of the strongest. Whereas after World War II, we had, for example, in Germany, we had the free market, but it was a social free market system that ensured certain kind of social social services and social ideas that provide a more humane way of living. And this is exactly what is missing because we're now going to this idea of running our countries like a startup, where we have people, that we do not value, we don't place a value on human relationships, um, on so-called on certain kind of benefits like unemployment and childcare and a protection of the environment and care for for those who are disabled or elderly. And we're going to have to examine our values and our humanity. That's the only thing I think that will save us. If we decide that we do not want to live in a dictatorship, then we will resist. And again, this is the example of Wallenberg that, and that's why this case matters so much, that he represents this principled action. And this is exactly what we need to emphasize. If if we care about how we live, the quality of our lives, the quality of our human interactions, then we're going to have to make a change. And in the end, that will only come if we're going to actively oppose these structures and not sacrifice them to short-term gains, profits, money, because otherwise we are really in danger of losing our humanity.
So we have the Wallenberg case versus TikTok, and I'm simplifying it greatly, but my point is, you have extremely courageous individuals who also suffered as victims of repression, whose cases are quite frankly chilling in many ways. And then you have the content, the empty, mindless entertainment slash propaganda content disseminated through mass social media platforms that the younger people are attracted to because it requires relatively little effort, it results in quick gain, and doesn't require any sacrifices whatsoever. So how can this narrative of encouraging principled individuals who are very likely to suffer horrible fates prevail over this sort of nihilistic, hedonistic social attitude?
Well, I think we have to put a premium on education.
Mm-hmm.
What we have not done is really enhanced and promoted the idea of critical thinking. In our education system, we've gone more and more to, multiple choice tests, checking off certain kind of, whatever targets of, learning of education, but we are not promoting critical thinking, critical analysis, creativity, etc. And all of these things will have to happen, and we have to find a way to promote them, even as some of the systems that we are now having want to tell us that we cannot afford arts education or music education because it's not efficient, or it's not effective, or it's not worth it. The humanities are crucial. Humanistic philosophy was essential to Wallenberg's mission, and it's essential to our future as human beings on this planet. And so we're going to have to invest in ourselves. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to counter these forces that are trying to strip these very ideas and this our ability to oppose these kind of forces. Because if we're constantly distracted, if we uh, do not want to have complex thoughts or engage in complicated discussions, if we want to suppress dissent, if we're not interested in a broad spectrum of views, even though that is what generates ideas and creativity and allows us to move forward. But if we want to suspend all of that, if we want to repress it, then we're going to become one-dimensional human beings, and we're going to become cogs in a machine. So it will take an enormous effort to counter these forces, but we carry in ourselves both the seeds of destruction, but also the ability to overcome and to flourish. So we have to, as human beings, decide what we want to do, and then that will carry us forward. And you see flashes of this in Georgia. You see the opposition in Germany, and we have to hope that people will actually carry through and carry on, because in the end, I think the power of democracy is unstoppable. It's an unstoppable force if we allow it to, and if we enable it to move us forward.
Thank you so much. I think this is a valuable look at the situation. I hope your research will continue, and I hope there can be some sort of a pressure point to get to the bottom of the story to find out the whole truth about it. I think it has value. It has value, first of all, as a political pressure point on Russia and on exposing its history of outright lies, which are now affecting and poisoning the entire global atmosphere. But on the other hand, it also has a value in itself, regardless of the current political conditions, because truth in itself is a value for its own sake, and it's the pursuit of truth that that is actually the best defense of from the kind of authoritarian creep that we've been witnessing over the past couple of decades.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was very nice and very important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and keep up your important work.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.